Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Good evening. What I'm about to tell you happened over 25 years ago, but it still weighs on me in a way I can't explain. I've never spoken about all the details to anyone, not even my wife. Maybe putting it down in words will help ease the burden somehow. My name is Andrew. Back then, I was a 16-year-old kid, an only child raised on a small ranch in eastern Montana that barely deserved the name. It was a simple life up before dawn, asleep when the sun went down. My father, Marcus, was a good man, maybe too good for his own good. My mother, Rose, was the heart of our home, always had fresh coffee brewing and cornbread waiting on the table. We didn't have luxury, but we never went hungry. The problem was that my father's goodness was the kind people mistake for weakness. He was a man of his word, the type who believed a handshake was worth more than any signed contract. And that's how our peace began to slip away. Our neighbor across the fence line was a man named Victor Dalman. He owned better land than ours, more cattle, higher yields. He was respected in the county, seen as smart and forward-thinking. He bought our modest milk production and paid cash, which was a real help to us. But I, with that adolescent arrogance that thinks it knows everything, started getting a bitter taste in my mouth every time he showed up at our place. Victor would propose deals to my father that seemed fair on paper, a trade of young bulls here, an advance payment there. But somehow, we always came out losing in the end. And then, our cattle started disappearing. First, it was a heifer that my father swore had wandered into the brush, then another and another. In less than a year, we lost 7 head. It wasn't normal, 1 or 2 getting lost, sure, that happens. But 7, without leaving a trace, it was like the earth had swallowed them whole. That kept me awake at nights. The breaking point came one afternoon when I went looking for a stray that had separated from the herd. I walked all the way to the boundary with Victor's land and saw his cattle grazing in the distance. I swear I saw 3 of our missing cows among them. I knew every marking, every way of walking our animals had. I came home with my chest tight and my mouth dry and told my father what I'd seen. He listened in silence, never taking his eyes off his coffee cup. When I finished, he just shook his head slowly. Andrew, son, cattle all look alike. We can't go making false accusations against a neighbor. Victor's been nothing but helpful to us. That answer turned my stomach. It wasn't just about losing the livestock. It was the humiliation, seeing my father, the man I admired most, bow his head like that. I felt shame, a burning shame that was worse than anger. And I think that shame is what started everything that came after. Things continued like that for a few more weeks. We pretended nothing was happening, and Victor kept that knowing smile at the corner of his mouth whenever he crossed paths with us on the dirt road. Every good morning, he made my stomach turn. I started avoiding even looking toward his land, so I wouldn't have to see what I knew was there. It was on one of those afternoons, a humid day with the smell of rain that never comes, that everything started getting strange. I was clearing a trail we used to lead the cattle to the creek for water, a narrow path through tall grass and loose stones. I was focused on my work, sweat running down my face, when I felt I wasn't alone anymore. I looked up and saw a man standing about 20 yards from me, near a cluster of sage brush. He had emerged from the grass without making a single sound. He was a thin man, skin weathered by sun, wearing the worn clothes of someone who lives by manual labor, faded jeans, mud-caked boots, and an old hat on his head. At first glance, he was just another ranch hand from the area, but there was something wrong with him. His eyes seemed a little too wide open, and his mouth was a thin line that stretched in an odd way across his gaunt face. He walked toward me slowly, without hurry. My first instinct was to grip the handle of my hoe tighter. The man stopped at a safe distance, raised his hand in a silent greeting, and said in a scratchy, dry voice, "You're Marcus's boy, aren't you?" I just nodded, unable to speak. He then adjusted his hat, and that fixed stare of his seemed to be measuring me from the inside. "They're taking advantage of you, kid," he said, without beating around the bush. "That Victor is an envious man, taking advantage of your father's goodness to line his pockets." The silence that followed his words was heavy. It was exactly what I thought, what I felt, but hearing it from a stranger's mouth left me speechless. Who was this man? How did he know? "He takes the good cattle and leaves you the scraps," the man continued, his voice now with a tone of contempt. "And your father only knows how to pray and hope the world is fair. But the world isn't fair, boy. The world belongs to the clever." He took a step toward me, and I instinctively stepped back. A crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes appeared on his face. "Someone needs to show him that you don't mess with his family." With that, he turned his back on me and disappeared into the grass again with the same absence of sound with which he had appeared. I stood there, the hoe heavy in my hand, my heart beating out of rhythm. I didn't feel fear of him in that moment. What I felt was a wave of anger, a bitter confirmation of everything I had been churning over alone. That man, whoever he was, had spoken aloud everything I'd been brooding about inside. And he was right. My father wasn't going to do anything. If something was going to change, it would have to be me. The man's words kept echoing in my head. I spent the next 2 days in heavy silence, churning it over endlessly. Every time my father sighed looking at our increasingly empty pasture, a spark of rage ignited in my chest. That feeling was like an animal gnawing at me from the inside, telling me I couldn't just stand there watching anymore. So I made a decision, a stupid kid's decision that I made without thinking about the consequences. One late afternoon, with the sky already turning orange, I told my mother I was going to check the back fence and left. But I didn't go to the fence. I went straight to Victor's ranch. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat with each step I took. I didn't have a plan, didn't know what I was going to say. I just knew I couldn't swallow that situation anymore. I found him near the corral, adjusting a horse's saddle. He looked me up and down, surprised to see me there. "What do you want, boy?" he asked, his voice without a hint of friendliness. I took a deep breath, trying to make my voice come out firm. "Mr. Dalman, I wanted to talk about our cattle." He stopped what he was doing and stared at me, narrowing his eyes. "What about your cattle?" I started stumbling over my words. "We noticed some have gone missing, and I was thinking, sometimes they get mixed in with yours, right? And some of yours look a lot like the ones that were ours." I didn't accuse him directly. I didn't have the courage. I tried to make it sound like a doubt, an unfortunate coincidence. But he understood immediately. His face, already red from the sun, turned the color of a ripe cherry. "What are you trying to insinuate, boy?" he growled, taking a step toward me. The man was big, and next to him I felt like a wisp of nothing. "Are you calling me a thief in my own home?" "No, sir, that's not it, I just—" "Shut your mouth," he shouted, and his voice cracked in the air. "I don't need to steal anything from anyone, much less from that misery your father calls a ranch. A disrespectful kid like you coming here to disrespect me. Does your father know about this?" I shook my head, feeling my face heat up. "Well, he should, to teach you some manners. Now get off my land. Get out of here before I lose my patience completely." He pointed toward the gate, his arm outstretched and trembling with rage. I didn't say anything more, just turned and left, walking as fast as I could without running. I could hear the curses he was muttering behind me. In that moment, the shame passed. What remained was a cold, heavy hatred. It became clear to me that talking wouldn't accomplish anything. People like Victor didn't understand words. They only understood another language. And deep down, I knew that man from the grassland, that ranch hand, would appear again. And next time, I would listen more carefully. My father never learned about my trip to the neighbor's land. I didn't tell him, and Victor apparently preferred not to take the story further either. But the result was immediate. The following week, he sent word through a third party saying he wouldn't be buying our milk anymore. That was a blow. It was little money, but it was the only steady money coming in. We felt the squeeze right away. My mother had to start making cheese to try to sell at the farmer's market, work that exhausted her. Seeing her fatigue, my hatred for Victor only grew, turning into something hard and bitter inside me. I think it was about 2 weeks after that cutoff that I saw the man again. I was by the creek, sitting on a rock, just watching the water flow, feeling like the most useless of men. And like the other time, he simply emerged from among the trees as if he sprouted from the ground. This time he seemed different, thinner, maybe. His eyes shone with a feverish gleam, and that crooked smile was stamped on his face before he even opened his mouth. He didn't look like a tired ranch hand anymore. He looked like a hungry animal. And for a second, under the weak light, the shadow of his hat seemed to twist into something different. He approached and stopped in front of me, close enough for me to smell a strange odor coming from him. A smell of dust and moldy, stored things. "I saw what you did," he said with that gravel voice. "It was brave, but it didn't accomplish anything, did it? People like him don't understand conversation. People like him only learn through pain." I remained silent, my heart beating hard in my chest. "I can help you," he leaned in a little, speaking almost in a whisper. "I can make him pay for every stolen animal, for every drop of your mother's sweat. I can make his life hell. You don't need to dirty your hands. You don't need to do anything." He paused, and his eyes stared at me in a way that seemed like he could see inside my head. "You just need to really want it deep down. You just need to wish for it to happen." I stood there paralyzed. Part of me wanted to scream, tell him to go away, run off. But another part, the part that was poisoned by shame and hatred, stayed quiet. I didn't say yes, but I also didn't say no. I just kept looking at him. And in my silence, I wished. In that instant, the air suddenly turned cold, and the smell of mold and dust became more present, almost tangible. With all the strength I had, I wished that Victor would feel on his skin everything we were feeling. The man smiled, a wide, frightening smile that showed yellowed teeth. "Well then, it's a deal," he said and turned, disappearing into the grass so quickly I didn't even see where he went. A week later, the rumors started. A young man who worked on a neighboring ranch told my father that Victor's cattle had caught a strange disease. The cows were weak, listless, and the milk came out thin, sometimes with dark streaks. The veterinarian went there and found no explanation. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but then something strange happened. Our few cows, which had been somewhat dejected because of the poor pasture, suddenly seemed livelier. Their coats became shiny, they started eating with more appetite, and the milk bucket that had been coming back half full started filling up again. It was a small improvement, almost imperceptible, but I noticed. My father thought it was the weather that had improved. My mother thanked God, but I knew. Deep in my soul, I knew that health wasn't ours, it had been taken from somewhere else. And the fear I felt was as great as the dark satisfaction that came with it. Things at Victor's ranch went from bad to worse. The disease in the cattle spread quickly. Later, we learned through gossip at the general store that his wife had suffered a bad accident, a fall in the corral that left her bedridden. Each piece of bad news that arrived was a chill down my neck, and at the same time, a stab of guilt that made me feel dirty. Because while misfortune was settling on the other side of the fence, our life seemed to have found its groove. The milk continued good. We managed to sell the cheese at the market for a fair price. And even one of our cows that had been pregnant for a long time, and that we thought wouldn't make it, gave birth to a strong, healthy calf. My father walked around smiling with relief. My mother constantly thanked the heavens, and I lived in fear. I began to feel we were being watched. It was a constant sensation, a weight in the air, especially when the sun started to go down. I saw movements in the corner of my eye, shapes that disappeared when I turned. At first I told myself it was fatigue, that it was my head playing tricks on me. But the sensation only got worse. Until one night I saw it. I had gone to put up some chickens that insisted on sleeping outside the coop. It was almost dark, that hour when the sky turns deep blue and shadows stretch and deceive you. When I was walking back to the house, I looked toward the woods at the back of our property. Standing between two trees, silhouetted against the last light of day, there was a figure. And it wasn't the ranch hand. It was tall but walked somewhat hunched forward like an animal sniffing the ground. The body was thin, gaunt, and moved with small, nervous jerks. For a moment I thought it was a large animal, maybe an elk. But then the thing raised its head, and I saw in the dark silhouette. I saw the outline of two short, twisted horns that looked like dry branches sprouting from its skull. I froze, paralyzed, looking at that apparition without being able to breathe. The creature seemed to sense my gaze. It turned in my direction. I couldn't see its face in the darkness, but I felt its eyes on me. And then it started moving toward me. Not running, but with a quick, awkward trot, its long arms swinging in a way that wasn't human. That was the trigger. Fear broke the paralysis, and I took off. I ran like I'd never run in my life. I didn't dare look back. I just heard the sound of my own feet crushing the dry grass and the noise of my breath that I could barely draw. I felt its presence behind me, just a few yards away. A shadow of darkness chasing me. I stumbled, got up, kept running toward the yellow light of the kitchen window, which was my only point of safety. My lungs burned, my legs hurt. I reached home all at once, slamming the door with such force that the whole house shook. My mother jumped out of her chair, startled. "What happened, boy? You look like you've seen a ghost," she said with her hand on her chest. I was bent over, hands on my knees, trying to draw air that wouldn't come. I couldn't answer, just shook my head saying it was nothing, that I had just tripped and gotten scared by some animal. But I knew it wasn't just any animal. That thing was no longer just on the neighbor's ranch. It had crossed the fence. It was there for me, and I had nowhere to run. After that night, peace ended for good. I lived in a constant state of alert, jumping at any noise. The ranch that had always been my home became a place full of dark corners and threatening shadows. During the day, I could even distract myself with hard work. But as soon as night began to fall, the terror returned, settling in my stomach. I stopped walking alone after the sun went down. Any job that needed to be done away from the house, I invented an excuse to leave for the next day. But it didn't help. The thing no longer needed to be outside. It had found a way to get inside my head. It started with dreams. They were dreams so real that it hurt to wake up from them. In them, our ranch was different. The house was painted with a porch and everything. My mother cooked on a new stove, one of those with a glass oven, and we had a big white refrigerator that she'd always wanted. My father no longer drove our old pickup. He maneuvered a brand new truck, one of those we only saw passing on the highway. The corral was full of strong cattle, and we sold milk and cheese to lots of people. We didn't depend on anyone anymore. In those dreams, my parents hugged me. They smiled a smile of relief, of real happiness. "You saved us, son," my mother would say with her eyes full of tears. "You made us prosper. All your effort was worth it." I would wake up with my chest tight, sometimes with my face wet with tears, still feeling the warmth of their embrace. But the happiness would dissolve the instant I opened my eyes. And sometimes, in some of those times, it was there standing in the darkest corner of my room, a patch of darkness denser than the night itself. It didn't move, didn't make noise. It just stayed there, the hunched silhouette and twisted horns silently reminding me that everything I had dreamed had a price. I would turn to the other side, cover myself up to my head, and pray for dawn to come soon. The thing was no longer content just to appear. I started hearing whispers when I was alone in the field. A hoarse voice that sounded like wind passing through a crack would say things in my ear. It said that Victor would rot in misery, that everything he took from us would be returned double, that I wasn't to blame for anything, that I deserved all the good things the dreams showed. Then came the marks. I would wake up with scratches on my arms, thin red lines as if they had been made with a dry branch or a very long nail. I showed them to my mother, who got worried, thinking it was some allergy, some bug, but I knew it wasn't. The worst was when I was working milking the cow, for example. I would feel a weight sink the ground beside me, as if someone very heavy had sat there, inches from me. I couldn't see anything, but I felt the presence. The air would become denser, the smell of mold and dust would return, and the voice would whisper closer and closer. "Just accept it, and all this will be yours." I tried to ignore it, concentrate on work, but it was impossible. I was living in a private hell, fear and hauntings during the day, wonderful dreams at night that showed me the life I so wanted for my parents. The creature was breaking me little by little, wearing me down. And as much as it terrifies me to admit, a part of me, the most tired and desperate part, began to wonder what, after all, was the price it wanted to collect. I was at my limit. I hadn't slept well for weeks, ate poorly, and jumped at anything. My mother, poor thing, thought it was some illness. She made tea, asked me to rest. Little did she know that rest was the last thing I could find. One afternoon, my father asked me to go look for a heifer that had strayed from the herd and entered the thicket, a more densely wooded area at the back of the ranch. I went, dying of fear. Every crack of a branch, every leaf the wind dragged made me jump. I called for the heifer, but only the sound of my own voice came back. The air was heavy still, and a strong smell of wet ash and rot began to stink up the place. I knew what that meant, and then I saw him. He came out from behind a thick trunk, and this time there was no shadow or distance to fool me. The sunlight filtered through the leaves illuminated the creature. It was a sick dog standing upright, a mangy dog with dark skin stretched over bones, balancing on two crooked legs. Its arms were long and thin, ending in claws that looked like dry roots. Its muzzle opened in a constant grin, showing dark gums and thin, yellowed teeth like needles. And the eyes were two opaque, lifeless beads that stared at me with an intelligence, a cleverness that was ancient and malevolent. I couldn't move. It was as if my legs were no longer mine. The air got stuck in my throat. The creature took a step toward me, then another, with that broken walk, and then it charged. It was too fast. Before I could think about running, that fetid body crashed against mine. The impact threw me to the ground hard, knocking all the air out of me. Its weight on my chest was crushing. Its face approached mine, and the breath that came from that mouth was hot vapor with the smell of rotten meat. I turned my face, holding back vomit, and it spoke. It was no longer a whisper. It was a guttural voice, a growl that dragged between frightening laughter. Time to pay for the help, boy. I felt its claws squeezing my shoulders, digging into my skin. Tears ran down my face, silent from pure terror. I want your mother, the creature growled, and the sound seemed to come from inside my own chest. The root, the matriarch. Those words hit me with more force than its body. I looked back into those dead eyes, not understanding. She's already old, tired, the creature continued, laughter bubbling in its throat. Her strength is gone. Her faith is useless now. She only holds you back. It brought its muzzle even closer, the tip of its cold nose touching my cheek. Give her to me, give me the matriarch. You, as her son, can do this. It's your right. Offer her to me, and your lineage changes. I'll make you the new pillar, strong, respected, rich. No one will ever laugh at you again. No one will ever step on your father. Your name will be known. It's a fair trade, a spent life for a lifetime of glory. In that moment, the fear of the beast disappeared. What remained was the horror of the proposal. The image of my mother, of her tired but always smiling face, invaded my mind, and a sob of desperation escaped from my chest. With what little strength I had left, I closed my eyes and began to pray silently, just in my head. I prayed the Hail Mary, the prayer my mother taught me when I was a child, the only one that came to mind. I prayed desperately, clinging to each word like a drowning man. Then something changed. The weight on me seemed to hesitate. The creature let out a sharp sound, a yelp of pain and rage. I felt a sudden cold, and the weight disappeared. I opened my eyes, trembling. There was nothing there, just a pile of crushed leaves and a sour smell in the air. I lay on the ground for I don't know how long, looking at the treetops, my whole body aching, my soul in pieces. I had said no, and I knew that the payment for that refusal wouldn't be long in coming. The retaliation didn't take long, and it was crueler than if it had been against me. 3 days after the attack in the woods, my father came home dragging himself, his face pale and sweating cold. He was holding his arm, which had 2 ugly, purplish marks. He said a timber rattler had bitten him near the creek. My mother went into despair, ran to make a tourniquet, apply herb poultices, give him moonshine that she kept for these emergencies. That night, with his body burning with fever, my father told something that made my blood run cold. He said that a little before the snake bit him, he saw a strange animal watching him from the other side of the creek. A dog, he said, but one that walked upright, with a twisted body and arms too short. My father threw a stone at it, but the thing didn't even move. It just stayed there, grinning at him. It was when he was running away that he stepped on the snake without seeing it. At that moment, I broke down. I sat with both of them by the bed where my father was delirious with fever and told them everything. I started with my hatred, with my shame. I talked about the first encounter with the ranch hand, the offer of help, the strange improvement of our cattle, the horned shadow, the dreams, the scratches. Finally, with my voice choked, I told them about the horrible proposal the creature had made to me in the woods. They didn't doubt me for a second. My mother cried softly, praying, and my father, even in the middle of his fever, held my hand and said the fault wasn't mine. That night, for the first time in a long time, we weren't alone with our fears. We were together. As soon as my father improved a little, we united. Every night without fail, we prayed the rosary together in the living room. My mother hung blessed palm crosses on all doors and windows. The fear was still there outside, but inside the house we had a truce. The years that followed were ones of struggle. With my father still recovering, I had to take charge of the ranch. I learned to negotiate, to be firm without being dishonest. I learned not to bow my head to anyone. I worked from sun to sun, with the image of that beast always on my neck, pushing me forward. And slowly, very slowly, we began to climb out of the hole with our own sweat. Today, my life is different. I'm married, have 2 young children who run around this same ranch. My father and mother are elderly but healthy, and they spoil my children rotten. I managed to give them the life that creature showed me in dreams. The house is good, the truck is in the garage. The cattle are strong. I won, but there's a catch. I never saw the beast again. I never dreamed of it again. But I feel it sometimes. When I'm in the field and the sun starts to go down, I feel that same heavy air, that silence that screams. When my children run toward the woods playing, something inside me tightens in a way that physically hurts. I know that thing didn't go away. It's out there, waiting. Maybe it thinks that in the end the pact was sealed. I refused the trade, but my desire to see my family well, the hatred I felt. Maybe that alone was enough food. Maybe all my good life today is just the creature letting me fatten up to collect the main course later. I'm writing this because I can't stand keeping it to myself anymore. I look at my children, at my wife, at my elderly parents, and I'm terrified. Terrified that the door I opened with my hatred over 25 years ago never really closed. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Good evening. My name is Catherine. After much thought, I found the courage to write this. I'm not sure if it's a confession or just getting things off my chest, maybe both. I need to tell this to someone who won't look at me with pity or think I've lost my mind. The truth is, sometimes I doubt my own sanity myself. My story with Robert began when I was 21, and we married about 4 years later. A simple life, you know, the kind built in a small Midwest town where the rhythm of things is dictated by the seasons and the harvest cycles. We lived in a good house that belonged to his father, and we had our 2 children, Lydia and Thomas. For more than a decade, I truly believed I had everything I needed: a family, a routine, solid ground under my feet. Robert was never much of a talker. He's a strong man, the type who understands engines, farming, fixing whatever breaks. He worked as a supervisor at a large agricultural cooperative in the region, a job that demanded a lot from him. Sometimes he traveled, stayed a day or 2 away to solve some problem with suppliers in another city. It was normal. He always came back the same quiet, with the smell of dust and fatigue on him. But things change. And it's not like thunder announcing a storm. It's more like a thin crack that appears in the wall that you ignore at first. It started with clothes. One day he showed up with a new button-down shirt, good fabric. I complimented it, asked where he'd bought it. He just shrugged, said a salesman had come by and he took advantage of the offer. Strange, because Robert hated spending money on clothes. A week later it was another shirt, then a pair of shoes I'd never seen. Along with the clothes came a different smell. He started using a woody cologne that lingered on towels and pillows. And he began taking 2 showers a day, one in the morning, before leaving, and another as soon as he got home, even before giving the children a kiss. I tried not to think too much about it. They said the new manager at the cooperative was demanding, hard on everyone. Maybe he was just trying to make a good impression. I don't know. I clung to any excuse I could find. What bothered me most, however, was the silence. Robert's old silence was comfortable. It was just his way. This new silence was heavy, full of unspoken things. He would arrive, take his long shower, sit at the table for dinner, and his eyes seemed to go right through the kitchen wall. He was there, but he wasn't. The evening outings became more frequent. Going to handle a shipment that arrived late, he'd say. Need to settle accounts with some people. I just nod and tell him to be careful on the road. What else could I do? I didn't want to be the wife who makes scenes, who controls every step. I just wanted that crack to stop growing. My breaking point came on a Tuesday. Robert arrived after 10 at night with the smell of alcohol and a fatigue that didn't seem to come from work. He said the truck from one of the farms had broken down on the road and he needed to handle it. He kissed my forehead, said he was dead tired and was going straight to bed. I just watched him walk down the hallway. That night, something inside me decided I couldn't live with doubt anymore. I waited until I was sure he was sleeping deeply, which didn't take long. The sound of his breathing filled the room. I went to the living room where he'd left his phone charging. My heart weighed a ton in my chest. In almost 15 years of marriage, I had never once thought about invading his privacy. But there, in the dark of our house, it seemed like the only thing to do was turn on a light, even if it might burn my eyes. I picked up the device. The screen lit up, and I had to dim the brightness so I wouldn't wake anyone. I went straight to the messages. and it was all there. A contact saved just with the letter J. The conversations left no room for interpretation. They were pet names, hearts, photos I couldn't see clearly in the dark, but that weren't for me. Entire phrases that he hadn't said to me in years. I didn't feel anger. I didn't have the urge to wake him up screaming, to smash the phone against the wall. What I felt was a cold emptiness, something that started in the pit of my stomach and rose up, leaving everything hollow inside. I stood there looking at that screen, I don't know for how long. Then I deleted the notifications, put the phone back exactly where it was, and returned to bed. I lay next to him and kept my eyes open until daybreak. The following days were theater. I cooked, took care of the children, washed his clothes, and never once brought up the subject. He also acted as if everything was normal, but now I knew. Every time he left more dressed up, every long shower, every silence at the dinner table was a confirmation. I started searching, going through pants pockets before putting them in the wash. I found a receipt from a restaurant in a neighboring town, one he said he never had to go to for work, a meal for 2 people. I kept that little piece of paper along with my savings. I needed to see. I needed something that wasn't just a message on a screen. In our town, everyone knows things even if nobody talks about them openly. I knew there was a man who did that kind of service. He didn't have an office, didn't advertise. He was a name whispered when someone needed to discover an inconvenient truth. I met him in one of those old dive bars near the bus station, a dark place with the smell of beer and fried food. I handed him the money I had saved, almost everything I had put away. I asked him to follow Robert. I asked for photos, places, times, everything. The man looked at me for a moment with eyes that seemed never to blink. He didn't ask questions, showed no surprise. He just took the money, counted the bills under the table, and nodded. A week later, he called me from an unknown number and asked to meet him behind one of the cooperative's warehouses. I got there, and he was already waiting for me, leaning against a wall. Without saying a word, he handed me a large brown envelope. My hands were shaking when I took it. Inside were several photographs. In all of them, Robert was with a young woman with dark hair, much younger than me. They walked hand in hand on a dirt road near the reservoir. They went into a small wooden cabin together that looked almost abandoned. In another, they were laughing inside his pickup truck. The cold certainty I had felt the night with the phone now had a face. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen in the dark with the photographs spread out on the plastic table. I looked at my husband's face laughing with another person, and I wasn't thinking about divorce, about fights, about leaving. What was going through my head was something else, something deeper, more primal. That was mine, the house, the children, the man sleeping in our room. All of that was my life, and I wasn't going to let some girl, some outsider, come and take my place. It wasn't a question of revenge. It was a question of survival. The next day, after dropping the children at school, I made my decision. I put on simple clothes, wrapped a scarf around my head to protect myself from the strong sun, and walked to the other side of town, to a neighborhood of dirt streets where the houses are more humble. I knew where to go. Everyone knew about the existence of Mrs. Sybil, an old woman people sought out to bless children against the evil eye, but who folks also said knew how to untie knots of another kind. Her house was the last on the street, a small brick building with a yard full of pots with all kinds of herbs, and some faded saint images at the entrance. She answered me as if she'd been expecting me. She was a very elderly woman with completely white hair pulled back in a thin, long braid and eyes so deep they looked like two dark holes. She didn't smile, just opened the way for me to enter. I sat in a plastic chair, the only one besides the one she used. The room was small, dark, and had a strong smell of dried leaves and candle smoke. Without beating around the bush, I told her everything. The change in him, the messages, the photos. She listened without moving, without blinking. When I finished, she was silent for a while, then spoke with a hoarse voice that seemed to scrape the air. To tie a man back, first you need to untie the knot that binds him elsewhere. I nodded without really understanding. What do you need? I asked. $2,500 and a piece of his clothing. Sweaty, something he wore recently. That same night, when Robert was sleeping, I took a shirt of his from the dirty clothes basket. It was the one he'd worn to work all day. I put it in a bag, and the next day I returned to Mrs. Sybil's house. I handed over the bag and the money. She took them, but shook her head, missing the other end of the knot. I need something that belongs to the girl. I felt a chill in my stomach. I said I had no way to get that. She gave me that deep look again. Without it, the work cannot be completed. The bond is not cut in the air. It's cut at the source. I found a way. I went back to the man who had sold me the photos. I offered him the rest of my savings. I begged, pleaded for him to get anything of hers. He said it would be difficult, risky. I said I'd pay the price. 3 days later, he handed me a small matchbox. Inside was a lock of dark hair tied with red thread and a small piece of dress fabric. I didn't ask how he got those things. I didn't want to know. I took the box to Mrs. Sybil. She took the objects, carried them to a corner of the room where there was a small, cluttered altar full of ribbons, candles, and strange figures. She lit a black candle and told me to leave. What is done here dies here. In 3 days you call me. Don't talk about this with anyone. Now go. I went, and the only thing I felt was fear, mixed with a stab of hope. The 3 days that followed were the longest of my life. I pretended normalcy in front of the children and Robert, but inside, every minute dragged. With every phone ring, my whole body shivered. At home, the tension was the same as always. He kept arriving late with the same distant air. I was already starting to think I had thrown my money and my soul in the trash. At the end of the afternoon on the 3rd day, I couldn't stand it anymore. I went to the payphone near the bakery and called the number Mrs. Sybil had given me. A young voice answered. I think it was her granddaughter. I asked to speak with Sybil. I waited a while, listening to a radio crackling on the other side of the line, until that hoarse voice of hers sounded in my ear. Hello, it's me, Catherine, I said in a low voice. I called to know. She cut me off. The work is done, just wait. What was tied does not come undone. And she hung up. She didn't give me time to ask anything more. I went home with that last phrase echoing in my head. Does not come undone. At the time, I felt relief. Today, I understand that was a warning, and she was right. The effect started showing about 2 days later. Robert came home at 6 in the evening. He didn't say anything special, but his simple presence at that hour was already a shock. The next day, the same thing. The nighttime outings stopped completely. He started staying home, sitting on the sofa with the children to watch television, helping me set the table. At first, I felt joy, a sense of victory that made me forget everything. I had succeeded. I had my husband back. I looked at him sitting in his chair and thought, I won. But that feeling didn't last long. It lasted until I started really paying attention. Yes, Robert was there. His body was there. But it seemed like the person who lived inside had gone away. He talked more with me, but the conversations were strange. I would talk about my day, about the children, and he would just nod with aha or without ever giving an opinion, without ever asking a question. The voice was his, but it sounded mechanical, as if he were reading a script. His gaze was the worst part. It had become a glassy look that didn't focus on anything. Sometimes I was talking to him, and I realized he wasn't looking at me, but at some random point behind my shoulder. And he'd stay like that still, for seconds that seemed like minutes, until suddenly blinking as if waking from a trance. One night I prepared the steak he liked most. He sat at the table, looked at the plate, and stayed there with the fork and knife in his hand without moving. "Aren't you going to eat, Robert?" I asked. He blinked, looked at me as if he didn't recognize me for an instant, and then at the plate. I'm going to eat." And he started cutting the meat and taking it to his mouth, but in a slow, automatic way, without seeming to taste anything. The children noticed too. Thomas, the youngest, who used to hang around his neck all the time, stopped looking for him to play. One day Lydia asked for help with a math lesson. Robert took the notebook, looked at the numbers for a long time, and then gave it back to her. "I don't know how to do this, daughter," he said, and his voice was flat, without any emotion. At night in bed, it was like I was lying next to a stranger. He didn't seek me out, didn't touch me. When I hugged him, his body became rigid, his breathing didn't change. It wasn't like before when he was angry or tired. It was different. It was like hugging something hollow. I got what I wanted. Robert was home every night. He didn't talk to the other woman anymore, I was sure of it. He was there physically, occupying his place at the table, in bed, in life. But the man I had married, that quiet but present man, had disappeared. In his place was this shell, this puppet that moved through the house and looked at me with eyes that saw nothing. And the silence that before was one of betrayal was now the silence of emptiness. A much, much more frightening silence. A few weeks passed in that strange, silent routine. I was almost getting used to the new Robert, to that ghost that walked through my house. I convinced myself it was the price to pay, and that with time maybe he would get better. A part of me, the most foolish part, still had hope. That hope ended on a Saturday morning. I was hanging clothes on the line in the backyard when Mrs. Louise, our neighbor across the fence, called me. "Catherine, honey, you won't believe this," she said with that voice of someone carrying hot gossip. "I heard about that girl, the Jessica who worked at the herb shop downtown." My heart stopped. I just stared at her holding a clothespin tightly. "What about her?" I managed to ask. "They found the poor thing, my dear. They pulled her body from the reservoir this morning. They say she'd been in the water for days. The police said it was an accident, that she must have slipped on the rocks and drowned. But what a thing, right? Such a young girl." I didn't hear anything else she said. I thanked her with a nod and went into the house, feeling my legs wobble. I went to the kitchen and sat down, looking at my hands. They weren't shaking. They were still cold. Accident, I knew deep down that hadn't been an accident. The bond is not cut in the air. It's cut at the source. Mrs. Sybil's voice came back with total clarity. The knot had been untied, and the price was that girl's life. When Robert came home from work, I watched him. He didn't seem to know anything. He had the same empty gaze, the same absent behavior. The news hadn't spread that much yet. He ate dinner in silence and went to bed. That night, for the first time, I was afraid to lie next to him. And it was that night that the real consequence of what I had done began. He started having nightmares. They weren't ordinary bad dreams. They were violent. He thrashed in bed, muttering broken words, names I'd never heard. The sheets would be soaked with sweat by morning, and he'd wake up pale, confused. I'd ask what had happened, and he'd just shake his head, saying he didn't remember anything. But it got worse each night. He started screaming in his sleep, muffled screams, as if someone were suffocating him. Sometimes he'd sit up in bed suddenly, with his eyes wide with terror, looking at the dark corners of our room. "Is someone here?" he whispered one early morning, his voice trembling. "They're watching me." I turned on the bedside lamp, showed him there was no one there, said it was just a nightmare. But I myself felt a strange chill in the air, a sensation that we weren't alone. I'd hug him, but his body would tremble nonstop. The turning point happened on a Thursday. I woke up in the middle of the night thirsty and saw that his side of the bed was empty. I got up, searched through the house. The moonlight was coming through the living room window, and I saw him. He was kneeling on the cold cement floor with his back to me, crying softly, a child's suffering cry. Next to him on the floor was a small, crumpled photo. I approached slowly. "Robert, what's wrong?" He didn't answer me. I knelt beside him to see what he was holding. It was a photo of Jessica, the kind you keep in your wallet. I felt a stab of the old anger, but it dissolved in fear when I saw the expression on his face. It wasn't longing. It was pure terror. "What are you doing with that?" I asked, my voice harder than I intended. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of tears and terror I'll never forget. "They said it was an accident," he sobbed, his voice broken. "But she didn't go away, Catherine. She won't leave me alone." I was paralyzed. I took the photo from his hand and waited. In that moment, I understood. The spell hadn't just brought my husband's body back. It had opened a door, and the thing that came along had just entered through it. After that night, the fear changed places. It stopped being just a ghost inside Robert's head and started leaking into the house like a dark, silent infiltration. The presence that before was focused on him now seemed to spread to every corner. It started with the smell, a sickly sweet and rotten odor that appeared out of nowhere, especially in the children's room. At first I thought it was some dead animal under the floorboards. I searched everything, cleaned with kerosene, with bleach. The smell would go away for a few hours and then come back stronger. It was a smell of forgotten flowers in a vase, rotting in water, a smell of wake. Then came the sounds. At night, when everything was quiet, we'd hear slow scratches that seemed to come from inside the walls, footsteps dragging in the ceiling, small things falling in the kitchen when no one was there. I'd get up, go see, and find nothing out of place. But the sensation that someone had just left there was strong. Robert stopped talking completely. He spent his days sitting in the armchair, his body getting thinner, his skin with a grayish color of someone who doesn't see the sun. He didn't react to anything anymore. The only thing he did was a repetitive movement with his index finger, tracing invisible drawings on his own leg. Always the same pattern for hours on end. I'd call him and it would take forever for him to turn his face in my direction, and when he did, his eyes didn't see me. The children were the ones who felt it most. Lydia, who was already 10, started refusing to sleep in her room. She cried, said she was afraid of the dark, of the smell. She started sleeping with me and Robert in the same bed. I'd hug her and feel her little body tremble all night. Thomas, at 5 years old, went back to wetting the bed. But the worst were his drawings. He had always liked to draw our family, me, his father, Lydia, and him, all stick figures smiling under a yellow sun. One day I found one of these drawings fallen on the floor. I picked it up to put it away and noticed something different. There were 5 people on the paper. Behind the figure that represented Robert, Thomas had drawn another figure. It was just a black scribble, tall and crooked, with long arms that dragged on the ground. It had no face or feet, just that dark shape stuck to his father's back. I was speechless. I started looking for his other drawings, and in all the recent ones, the figure was there. Sometimes it was in the corner of the room, other times at the window. Always tall, thin, and faceless. That was the shadow that had come to live in our house. Thomas had seen it. I didn't know what to do anymore. I tried to bless the house with a rosary, threw coarse salt in the corners, prayed everything my mother had taught me. Nothing worked. Things only got worse. One afternoon, I came home, and all the kitchen cabinet doors were open. Another time, the television turned on by itself in the middle of the night, on a channel that was off the air, with that static that fills the whole house. Our neighbors moved away. No one called me to chat at the gate anymore. If I went out on the street, people would look away. Our house became marked, an island of silence and fear in the neighborhood. One night I got up to drink water and passed in front of the big mirror we had in the hallway. I saw Robert's reflection standing in the middle of the dark living room. He was standing facing the wall with his head slightly tilted, as if he were listening to a secret. And then I heard him whisper. I couldn't understand the words. It was a low, hoarse murmur. He hadn't spoken to us in weeks, but there in the dark, he was talking to the wall or to whatever was on the other side of it. I went back to bed without making noise, lay down next to my daughter, and cried silently. It wasn't Robert's house anymore. It wasn't my house anymore. We were just the other residents, sharing the space with the real owner, the shadow my son drew. The situation became unbearable when I found Thomas, my son, talking alone in the backyard. He was crouched with his back to me, whispering to the wall of the laundry sink. I approached slowly. "Who are you talking to, honey?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He turned to me, and his eyes were too serious for a 5-year-old child. "To the tall man," he answered with complete naturalness. "He said he'll be able to play with us inside the house soon. He said Daddy's going to let him." That was like taking a punch to the stomach. The shadow was no longer hiding. It was promising. It was announcing itself. That same afternoon, without warning anyone, I walked back to Mrs. Sybil's house. I had no more money, nothing more to offer, just my desperation. She answered me at the door with the same deep eyes as always, and just said, "You took a while to come back." I entered, and before I could say anything, she interrupted me. "I know what's happening in your house. What you invited in is not a human soul. It's not a spirit of the dead. It's something else. It's a creature that feeds on emptiness, and you gave it a banquet in your husband's soul. You need to get it out of there," I begged, tears finally coming, Mrs. Sybil shook her head slowly. "Remove, my daughter. No one removes a root that has already taken hold in the earth. Expelling is no longer possible. Your man's body became the nest. What can be tried is to lock the nest from the outside. Lock the whole house. She explained what I had to do. It was binding work, a containment ritual. She gave me a bundle of tied herbs. There was guinea grass, rue, some dark leaves I didn't recognize. 3 black candles and a small bottle with a dark liquid that smelled strongly of rum and roots. I would have to wait until midnight, lock my children in the back room, and no matter what happened, not stop the ritual until the end. That night the house seemed quieter than ever, a frightening silence that comes before something bad happens. I put a mattress on the children's room floor, locked the door from outside, and told Lydia, the oldest, to sing to her brother and cover her ears if she heard noise. The fear in her eyes almost made me give up. At exactly midnight, I dragged Robert, who was limp like a rag doll, to the center of the living room. I placed the 3 black candles in a triangle around him. I lit the herbs in a clay plate. The smoke that rose was dense, burning, and quickly filled the environment. The instant the smoke touched Robert, he arched his back with a strength I hadn't seen in months. A violent spasm shook his body, and then he opened his eyes. But they weren't the empty eyes from before. They were eyes that had something clever and evil inside them. Something old. The house responded. The only light bulb still working in the living room exploded, throwing us into darkness lit only by candles. The doors of the bedrooms and bathrooms all slammed at once with a crash that made the walls shake. An abnormal cold took over the place, clinging to my skin like a soaked cloth. And it spoke. The voice came from Robert's mouth, but it wasn't his voice. It was a deep, dragging sound like stone rubbing. "You thought you could trap me here, you fool," the thing said while a horrible smile spread across my husband's face. "You opened the door for me. This house is mine. This body is mine." I ignored my heart beating uncontrollably, took the bottle with the dark liquid, and started drawing the symbols Mrs. Sybil had taught me on all the windows, starting with the kitchen one. With each symbol I completed, the reaction was more violent. Plates flew from the dish rack and shattered on the wall. "I'll take your children first," the voice growled. "I'll show them my real face." I ran to the living room window, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped the bottle. Robert started writhing on the floor, laughing a guttural laugh that didn't sound human. The big wooden cabinet in the living room fell forward with a deafening noise. Only the front door was left. I ran to it with the thing's voice screaming my name, cursing me. When I started drawing the last symbol on the door's wood, Robert's body rose from the floor, floating inches above the floor. I finished the last stroke at the exact instant my finger moved away from the door. Everything stopped. Robert's body collapsed to the floor like a bag of bones. The cold disappeared. The laughter ceased. The silence that fell on the house was absolute, heavier and deeper than any noise. I stood there in the middle of my destroyed living room, panting, covered in sweat. There was no more sound except my own breathing and the soft sobs coming from the children's room. The next day dawned with a silence that weighed more than any scream. The first thing I did was go to the children's room. Lydia and Thomas were awake, hugging each other on the mattress with red eyes from crying so much. I hugged them and said everything was over, that the noise wouldn't come back. I lied, of course. The noise from outside had ended, but the one inside my head was just beginning. I spent the day cleaning up the mess. I swept up the glass shards, lifted the fallen cabinet, scrubbed the marks of the symbols I had drawn on the windows and door. The house was clean, organized, looked like a normal place again. But it wasn't. The ritual worked. Mrs. Sybil's binding held the thing. The smells, the sounds, the doors slamming, all of that stopped. The violent presence retreated, but it didn't go away. It just quieted down, shrank inside its nest, inside Robert. He never again was even the empty shell he was before. Now he's just the body. He sits in the living room chair all day, looking at the wall. His eyes don't blink. His breathing is so light that sometimes I need to get close to make sure he's still alive. I feed him by hand, bathe him, change his clothes. He doesn't react to anything. He's an object, a statue of flesh and bone that I keep clean. The children grew up in that silence. Lydia was the first to leave. As soon as she turned 18, she packed a suitcase and went to live with an aunt in another city. She never talks about her father. She never asks. We both know it's better that way. Thomas stayed longer, but the weight of that house consumed him. He became a quiet, frightened young man. Today he lives far away, works with electronics, and calls once in a while to see if I'm okay. He never mentions his father. Neither of them calls him father. They call him him. I stayed. Where would I go? This house is my prison. It's my punishment. Sometimes, very late at night, when the house is completely dark, I sit in the chair in front of his armchair and I feel it. I feel the thing there inside, behind those open and blind eyes. It's quiet, contained, but it's alive, alert, waiting. It can't leave his body and can't leave this house. The binding worked. I wanted my husband back, and in a sick way, I have him. He never left me again. He's here, less than 3 feet from me, every day. I made the pact so I wouldn't lose him to another woman, and I ended up becoming his jailer for the rest of my life. I locked the cage door, and now I spend my days making sure it never opens. And sometimes, in the quiet of dawn, I swear I see his eyes blink once, slow, before that absolute emptiness takes over again. My name is David, and I'm 28 years old. I work for a tech startup here in Seattle, and I've always been a pretty grounded person. I never believed in supernatural or paranormal things until one early Sunday morning that completely changed my perspective on certain things. What I'm about to tell you might sound crazy, but I swear it happened exactly as I'm describing it. It was early November 2023, a Saturday night. I had gone out with some friends to a club in Capitol Hill, one of those places that stays open until sunrise. I don't usually drink much, but that night I overdid it a bit. Nothing too crazy, just enough to feel a little dizzy, but still aware of what I was doing. Around 4 a.m, I started feeling exhaustion hit me. It had been a rough week at work, and the alcohol was taking effect. I decided to leave and catch the night bus home. I live in Fremont, and from Capitol Hill at that hour. I always take the night line that goes through downtown Seattle. I walked to the bus stop on Pine Street near the Capitol Hill station. It was a cold, early morning, typical for late October in Seattle, with that cutting wind that pierces through your skin. The stop was empty, except for me waiting. I stood there for about 15 minutes until the bus appeared. It was a bus that runs the route from Fremont to downtown, passing through Capitol Hill, a night line I knew well that takes almost an hour to complete the entire route, passing through several neighborhoods in the city. The bus was nearly empty. with only about 5 people scattered across the seats. I got on, paid my fare, and went to sit in the back on the right side in a row that was empty. The bus had that characteristic smell of late-night public transportation, a mixture of disinfectant and something indefinable that only those who ride buses at dawn know. I leaned my head against the window glass and started to relax. The cold of the glass was comforting against my forehead, and the movement of the bus had something hypnotic about it. I could hear the engine rumbling, the sound of tires on asphalt, and occasionally the sound of some car passing in the opposite direction. That's when I decided to look at my reflection in the window glass, and that's when everything began. At first, I didn't notice anything strange. It was just my face reflected in the dark glass, slightly distorted by the light from the streetlights we passed. I looked normal for someone who had been drinking a little and was tired, slightly red eyes, messy hair, relaxed expression. But then something changed. For a fraction of a second, my reflection seemed different. The face was paler, almost grayish. The eyes seemed deeper, with dark circles I didn't have, and the expression was one of pure terror, as if I were seeing something horrible that I couldn't process. I blinked quickly and looked again. My reflection was normal, flushed face, normal eyes, calm expression, as if nothing had happened. I shook my head, thinking it must have been my imagination. It must have been fatigue mixed with alcohol, or maybe the light from the streetlights had created some optical illusion. These things happen. I tried to ignore it and went back to looking out the window, observing the streets of Seattle pass by. The bus was making its usual route through the city, passing down Denny Way toward South Lake Union. The streets were emptier now, with less car and pedestrian traffic. But curiosity got the better of me. I decided to look at my reflection again, and the same thing happened. For a few seconds, my face in the glass was completely different, pale, with deep dark circles, and that expression of absolute terror. It was as if I were looking at something that terrified me, but I couldn't see what. This time I paid more attention. The transformation wasn't gradual, it was instantaneous. 1 second I was normal, the next I had that haunted appearance, and when I blinked or moved my head, it immediately returned to normal. My heart started racing. That definitely wasn't normal. It wasn't fatigue, it wasn't alcohol, it wasn't an optical illusion. There was something very wrong happening. I looked around the bus to see if anyone else had noticed anything strange, but all the passengers seemed normal. A woman was sleeping in the front seats. 2 guys were talking quietly. A man was on his phone. The driver was driving calmly. I went back to looking out the window, but this time I avoided focusing on my reflection. I tried to concentrate on the scenery outside, the buildings, the streetlights, the parked cars, anything but the glass. But it was impossible not to notice the reflection. It was there in my peripheral vision, and occasionally I swore I saw that transformation happen again. Always the same thing, my face becoming pale, the sunken eyes, the expression of terror. I started sweating cold. This was making me very nervous. I thought about changing seats, sitting on another bench away from the window, but something prevented me from moving. It was as if I needed to understand what was happening. When the bus started moving again after a stop, I couldn't resist. I looked directly at my reflection in the glass, and this time it was worse. The transformation lasted longer. My face in the reflection was not only pale and with dark circles, but also with an expression of desperation. It was as if I were screaming, but without sound. My mouth was open, eyes wide, eyebrows furrowed in an expression of total panic. And the most frightening part, the reflection was looking directly at me. It wasn't like a normal reflection that follows your movements. It was as if it were another person staring at me through the glass. I blinked several times in succession, shook my head, ran my hand over my face. When I looked again, the reflection was normal, but the feeling that something was very wrong only increased. My breathing was getting accelerated. I started feeling that sensation of claustrophobia that sometimes comes in closed places. The bus that before seemed cozy and safe now seemed oppressive. I decided to get up and sit somewhere else, away from the window, but when I stood up, I felt a strong dizziness. I had to support myself on the seat in front to avoid falling. The movement of the bus that before was relaxing was now making me nauseous. I sat down again and breathed deeply, trying to calm myself. It must be the alcohol taking effect, or maybe I was getting sick. Sometimes when we're very tired and drink a little, the body reacts strangely. But deep down I knew it wasn't that. There was something supernatural happening, something I couldn't explain with logic. There were still about 15 minutes left to reach Fremont, 15 minutes that seemed like an eternity. I tried to distract myself by checking my phone, looking at social media, anything to take attention away from the reflection in the window. But it was impossible. It was as if the glass was calling me, forcing me to look. And every time I looked, the same thing happened. My reflection transformed into that haunted version of myself, pale, with dark circles, with an expression of terror that chilled my blood. I started noticing other details. When the reflection transformed, it wasn't just my face that changed. My clothes also seemed different. The jacket I was wearing seemed older, faded, and there was something strange about my reflection's eyes, as if they were seeing things I couldn't see. It was as if the reflection was showing me an alternative version of myself, a version that had gone through something terrible, that had seen things no person should see. The bus made another stop, this time in Wallingford. A passenger got off, and a young woman in work uniform got on, probably a nurse or nursing technician coming off the night shift. She sat a few seats in front of me and pulled out her phone. She seemed tired, but calm, a normal person living a normal life. I envied her at that moment. I wanted to be living a normal early morning, going home after a party, without having to deal with strange reflections and supernatural sensations. But when I looked at the glass again, the situation got even worse. This time when my reflection transformed, it didn't just look at me, it moved its lips as if trying to tell me something. I couldn't hear any sound, but I could clearly see that it was speaking. I tried to read the lips, understand what it was saying. It seemed to be one word repeated several times, something like danger or careful, but I wasn't sure. My heart raced. I started sweating even more and felt nausea rising. This wasn't normal. It wasn't hallucination. It was something real, something that was happening to me. The reflection continued speaking, and this time I could understand better. It was saying, "Get off," repeating it several times, "Get off, get off, get off." But get off where? The bus, the city, life. I tried to look around the bus to see if there was any imminent danger, but everything seemed normal. The driver was driving calmly. The other passengers continued with their activities. There was nothing indicating danger. I looked back at the reflection. And this time something impossible happened. It raised its hand and knocked on the glass from the inside. I heard the sound, a dull thud, as if someone were knocking on the glass from inside the bus. But that was impossible. I was on the inside. The reflection should be on the outside. I looked around to see if anyone else had heard the sound, but no one seemed to notice. It was as if only I could see and hear it. The reflection continued knocking on the glass, each time more desperately. The expression of terror on its face was becoming more intense, and it continued moving its lips, repeating that word, "Get off." I instinctively moved away from the window, leaning against the back of the seat. My heart was beating so hard I could hear the sound in my ear. My breathing was labored, and I felt like I was going to faint. I closed my eyes tightly and counted to 10, breathing deeply. When I opened them, I looked straight ahead, avoiding the window. I needed to calm down, needed to think clearly. But then I heard my own voice. It wasn't me speaking, it was the reflection. I could hear my voice coming from the window glass, whispering very low, almost inaudible, "David, you need to get off now." That's when I understood that this wasn't just a strange reflection. It was something much more serious, something that was trying to warn me about something. The bus was approaching Fremont. I recognized the streets, the buildings, the landmarks. A few more minutes and I would be home, away from that nightmare. But when I looked at the glass one last time, I saw something that made me make a decision. The reflection no longer had an expression of terror. Now it had an expression of urgency, of someone trying to save someone, and it was pointing forward, toward the driver. That's when I noticed the driver's head was tilting to the side, as if he were dozing off. The bus was starting to make a turn that was too sharp, more than it should. I understood immediately what the reflection was trying to warn me about. The driver had fallen asleep at the wheel. I got up quickly and shouted, "Driver, wake up." He woke up startled and corrected the bus's direction at the last moment. We had almost gone off the road and crashed into the median barrier. If I hadn't shouted at that moment, we probably would have had an accident. The driver stopped the bus on the shoulder, still shaking. He apologized to all the passengers, explaining that he had worked 2 consecutive shifts and was very tired. The other passengers were scared but relieved. Some got off the bus and preferred to call a taxi. I also got off, even though I was still a few blocks from my house. Before leaving, I looked one last time at the window glass where I had been sitting. My reflection was there, normal, without transformations, but this time it was smiling, a calm smile of someone who had completed their mission. I walked the remaining blocks to my house, still trying to process what had happened. The reflection had saved me, had warned me about the danger before it was too late. But who was that reflection? Was it myself from some alternate dimension? Was it my subconscious trying to protect me? Or was it something completely different? I'll never know the answer. But I know that if it weren't for that strange reflection, I probably wouldn't be here to tell this story. Since that night, I always pay attention to reflections, not out of fear, but out of respect. I learned that sometimes the strangest things that happen to us can be the ones that save us. And if one day you're going home at dawn and see something strange in the reflection of a window, don't ignore it. It might be that someone is trying to protect you from something you can't see yet. Because in the end, we don't always understand where help comes from. Sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places, even from our own reflection. I work as a sales representative and travel a lot around the city, always by subway. I know the metro system well, especially Union Station, which I use almost every day to transfer lines. What happened to me on a Tuesday night still makes me think. I had spent the entire day visiting clients in the downtown area and was heading home. My routine was always the same: take the red line from Union Station and transfer to the blue line to continue to my station. That night, I had left later from my last client. It was almost 11 p.m. when I arrived at the station. The movement was much lighter than during the day, with few passengers on the platforms. The night lighting created long shadows through the corridors. I passed through the turnstile and went down to the red line platform. There weren't many people waiting, so I chose a bench further away and settled in. That's when I noticed her. She was a woman about 60 years old, dressed completely in black. She was leaning against the station wall in a somewhat secluded part of the platform, away from the main area where the lighting was dimmer. She was crying softly, with her hands covering her face. My first reaction was concern. I thought maybe she had received some bad news or was going through some personal problem. Washington, D.C. can be a tough city, especially for older people who are alone at night. I got up from the bench and walked toward her, thinking about offering help. Maybe she needed someone to talk to or help contacting family. I've always been a caring person and couldn't stand still watching someone suffer. When I was about 15 feet away, I spoke in a low voice so as not to startle her. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need any help?" She stopped crying immediately. Slowly, she took her hands from her face and turned toward me, and that's when everything became strange. The woman's face was completely normal. There were no tears, no signs that she had been crying. Her eyes were dry, her expression was neutral, almost indifferent. It was as if I had imagined all the crying. She looked at me for several seconds without saying anything. She had an empty expression, as if she were looking through me, not at me. I felt a chill run up my spine. "Sorry to bother you," I said, feeling awkward. "I thought you needed help." She continued looking at me without responding. She didn't blink, didn't move. It was like she was a statue dressed in black. I started feeling uncomfortable. Maybe she had some mental problem or was in shock for some reason. I decided to try again. "Ma'am, are you waiting for the train? Can I help you with anything?" That's when she opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. She moved her lips, forming words I couldn't hear. It was as if she were speaking, but without a voice. Instinctively, I moved a little closer, trying to understand what she was saying. But when I took another step, something impossible happened. She simply disappeared. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't like she had moved away quickly. She was there, standing in front of me, and the next second she wasn't there anymore, as if she had never existed. I stood in the same place, looking at the empty wall where she had been. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe it was fatigue. It had been a long day, and maybe my mind was playing tricks, but I knew I had seen her. I had heard the crying, seen the black dress, looked directly at her face. It wasn't a hallucination. I looked around the platform to see if anyone else had seen anything. There were about 10 people waiting for the train, scattered across the benches. No one seemed to have noticed anything strange. Everyone was on their phones or looking at the tracks. I went back to my bench, still trying to process what had happened. Maybe she had hidden behind some column or quickly entered a restroom. There had to be a logical explanation. When the next train arrived, I got on and sat by a window. During the entire trip to my transfer station, I kept thinking about the woman in black. There was something very strange about that encounter, something I couldn't explain. But it was only the next day that I understood the gravity of what had happened. The next morning, I was having coffee and reading the news on my phone when I saw a story that made me freeze. It was about a crime that had happened in the Union Station area. Woman dies after mugging near subway station, the headline read. I read the entire article and the details disturbed me. A woman had been mugged the previous Monday, very close to Union Station. The robbers had taken her purse and fled, but she had hit her head in the fall and gone into a coma. She died Tuesday night at the hospital. Tuesday night, exactly when I had seen the woman crying at the station. But what caught my attention most was another detail in the article. The police were looking for the victim's family members, but so far no one had come forward. It was as if she had no family, no friends, no one in the world. A woman who died alone, with no one to mourn her. I started making connections in my head. Could it be possible that the woman in black was some kind of manifestation related to the death of this young woman? Maybe it was her mother or some relative crying for the loss. But that didn't explain how she had disappeared in front of me. During the day, I couldn't concentrate on work. I kept thinking about the woman, about the crying I had heard, about her empty facial expression. There was something very wrong about that whole story. That night when I was heading home, I decided to get off at Union Station again. I wanted to see if I would encounter the woman, if I could better understand what had happened. I arrived at the station around 10:30 p.m., almost the same time as the previous night. The movement was similar, few passengers, dim lighting, that end-of-day atmosphere that always made me a bit melancholic. I went straight to the place where I had seen the woman. It was a corner further away from the platform, near a wall where there were some old posters and graffiti. During the day, it must have been a normal place, but at night, it had something oppressive about it. I stood there for a few minutes, observing and waiting. Nothing happened. There was no one crying, no woman in black, no strange sound. I was about to give up when I heard it. It was soft crying, almost a whisper. It came from exactly the same place where I had seen the woman the night before, but there was no one there. The sound was unmistakable. It was the same crying I had heard the previous night, soft, contained, full of sadness. But this time, there was no one visible crying. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I looked around to see if any other passenger was hearing the same thing, but everyone seemed oblivious. A woman was reading a book, a young man was on his phone, an elderly man was dozing on a bench. No one showed any sign of having heard anything. I slowly approached the place where the sound was coming from. With each step, the crying became clearer, more real. It was as if there were an invisible person there, shedding tears for some deep pain. When I got very close to the wall, the crying stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more disturbing than the sound. It was as if someone had noticed my presence and decided to be quiet. I stood there without knowing what to do. Part of me wanted to leave, forget all this, and never return to that station. But another part was curious, wanted to understand what was happening. That's when I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, and she was there. The same woman in black from the night before, about 10 feet away. This time she wasn't crying. She was looking directly at me with that same empty expression. My heart raced. She had appeared out of nowhere, without making noise, without me noticing. It was as if she had materialized there. "Good evening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. She continued looking at me with those empty eyes, without blinking. There was something hypnotic about that stare, something that prevented me from looking away. I tried to take a step toward her, but my feet seemed glued to the floor. It was as if an invisible force was preventing me from moving. The woman opened her mouth again, as she had the night before. This time I could hear a very low whisper, almost inaudible. No one cried for her. The voice was hoarse, loaded with sadness. It didn't seem to come from her mouth, but from somewhere distant, like an echo. "What do you mean?" I asked, still unable to move. "No one cried for her," repeated the woman. "She died alone. No one came. No one cared." That's when I understood. She was talking about the young woman who had died after the mugging. The woman who had no family, who had no one to mourn her death. "Did you know her?" I asked. The woman in black slowly shook her head, without taking her eyes off me. "I am all those who die alone," she said. "I am the cry that no one sheds. I am the tear that no one weeps." A chill ran through my entire body. This wasn't an ordinary person. It was something much more complex, much deeper. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. She smiled for the first time, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was a sad, melancholic smile, full of pain I couldn't understand. "For someone to remember her," said the woman. "For someone to know she existed. For someone to cry for her, even if it's too late." And then, for the second time, she disappeared. But this time I understood what had happened. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with the woman in black. Her words echoed in my mind. No one cried for her. She died alone. I started researching more about the young woman who had died after the mugging. I discovered that her name was Sarah Mitchell. She worked as a cleaner in a commercial building, lived alone in a rented room in a distant suburb. She had no known family in Washington, D.C. The police had managed to identify her through fingerprints, but even so, no one came to claim the body. She was buried as an unclaimed person in a public cemetery, without ceremony, without flowers, without anyone to say goodbye. A life that faded without leaving traces, without touching other lives, without being remembered by anyone. This deeply disturbed me. I started thinking about how many people die like this alone, forgotten, with no one to cry for them. How many Sarah Mitchells exist out there, living invisible lives, dying silent deaths? I decided to do something that might seem strange to many people. I researched on the internet more details about the exact location where she had been mugged. According to the article, it had been on a side street near the station, a somewhat dark place where she probably passed every day coming back from work. I went there on a Saturday afternoon. It was a narrow street with little movement, exactly the type of place where a mugging could happen without witnesses. There was a small park nearby with some benches and trees. I bought some flowers on the way and left them there at the place where, according to the report, she had been found. It wasn't much, but it was what I could do. It was a way of saying that someone remembered her, that someone cared. I stayed there for a few minutes, thinking about her life, about the difficulties she must have faced, about the loneliness she must have felt. I imagined her passing through that street every day, going home tired from work, not knowing that one day she wouldn't make it home. I didn't know her in life, but I felt like I owed this to her. When I was leaving the place, I felt a familiar presence. I turned and saw the woman in black standing a few meters away, near one of the park trees. This time she was smiling, a true smile of gratitude. She waved at me, a gentle, almost imperceptible wave, and then, for the last time, disappeared. I never saw her again at Union Station. I never heard the soft crying on the platform again. It was as if she had found the peace she was looking for. But the experience changed something in me. I started paying more attention to the people around me, especially those who seemed alone, forgotten. I started greeting the building's doorman, talking to the woman who sells newspapers at the station, being kinder to the people who cross my path. Because I learned that we all, in some way, need to be seen, to be remembered, to be mourned when we leave. And sometimes a simple gesture of recognition can make all the difference. Sarah Mitchell died alone, but she wasn't forgotten. At least not by me, and maybe that's enough for her soul to find rest. The woman in black taught me that death isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a new way of existing, of touching other lives, of making a difference in the world. And maybe that's what matters most, not how we die, but how we're remembered, and how our stories, even the saddest ones, can inspire others to be more human, more caring, more present in the lives of those around us. I work at a consulting company on the 32nd floor of a commercial building in downtown Chicago. It's one of those old buildings constructed in the 1980s, with long corridors and lighting that always seemed insufficient. I never minded it until I started staying later at the office. The company was going through restructuring, and I had been promoted to project manager a few months earlier. With the promotion came extra responsibilities and, inevitably, overtime. It wasn't uncommon for me to leave around 10 or 11 p.m., finishing reports and preparing presentations. The office occupied the entire floor, with a reception at the entrance and a main corridor that extended about 65 feet to the back, where the director's offices were located. My desk was in an open area in the middle of the floor, surrounded by other workstations. During the day, the environment was busy and noisy, but at night it transformed into a completely different place. When everyone left, the silence was almost oppressive. The air conditioning made a constant noise, and occasionally you could hear the elevator going up or down, carrying the last employees from other floors. It was on a Thursday in September that everything began. It was almost 10:30 p.m. when I finished reviewing an important report that I needed to deliver the next morning. The floor had been completely empty for more than 2 hours. I was saving the file when I heard it. It was my name being called. It came from the end of the corridor, from the direction of the director's offices. Michael. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but clear enough for me to be sure I had heard my name. I stopped typing and listened carefully. The office was in total silence, just the hum of the air conditioning. I thought maybe it was some colleague who had forgotten something and come back, or maybe one of the directors who had been working late in one of the back offices. It wasn't impossible, although it was rare. "Hello," I shouted toward the corridor. "Is someone there?" No response. I went back to the computer, thinking maybe I had imagined it. I was tired, it had been a tough week, and maybe it was just the result of fatigue. But a few minutes later, I heard it again. "Michael." This time the voice seemed more distant, weaker, as if it came from very far away, or as if the person were whispering. There was something strange in the tone, something that made me feel a chill. I got up from the chair and walked to the entrance of the corridor. The night lighting created a yellowish and weak light, leaving several areas in shadow. The corridor stretched in front of me, with office doors on both sides, all closed. "Is someone there?" I asked again, this time louder. The silence that followed was even more disturbing. It was as if the entire building were holding its breath. I decided to investigate. I walked slowly down the corridor, paying attention to any sound or movement. My footsteps echoed on the marble floor, creating a constant rhythm that seemed amplified in the silence. I passed the first offices, all with closed doors and lights off. They were meeting rooms and offices of middle managers. Through the glass doors, I could see they were empty, with chairs organized and computers turned off. I continued walking toward the back of the corridor. With each step, the feeling that something was wrong increased. It wasn't just the silence or the dim lighting. There was something in the air, a tension I couldn't explain. When I reached the end of the corridor, where the director's offices were, all were closed and dark. I tested some doorknobs, but they were locked. It was obvious there was no one there. I stood for a few seconds, trying to understand what had happened. I was sure I had heard my name being called, and the voice seemed to come exactly from that direction. But there was no one there. Maybe it was some sound coming from another floor that had echoed through the ventilation ducts. Or maybe it was some building noise that my tired mind had interpreted as a voice. Old buildings make strange noises, especially at night. I was about to go back to my desk when I felt something that made me freeze. The air was freezing. It wasn't the air conditioning cold, which was constant and uniform. It was a different cold, localized, as if there were a stream of icy air coming from somewhere specific, and it was getting more intense. I looked around, looking for some open window or some air conditioning duct that could explain the temperature change. But all the windows were closed, and the ducts were on the ceiling, far from where I was. The cold was intensifying, and I started seeing my own breath forming small clouds of vapor. It was as if the temperature had dropped about 15 degrees in a matter of seconds. That's when I heard it again, "Michael." This time the voice was very close, so close it seemed to be right next to me. But when I turned, there was no one there. My heart raced. This definitely wasn't normal. It wasn't fatigue, it wasn't imagination, it wasn't echo from another floor. There was something very wrong happening in that corridor. I started walking back toward my desk, but this time faster. The cold sensation accompanied me for several meters, as if something invisible were walking beside me. When I reached the open area where my workstation was, the cold disappeared abruptly. The temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive feeling diminished. I sat in my chair, still trying to process what had happened. I picked up my phone and checked the time, 10:45 p.m. I decided it was better to leave. I could finish the report at home or arrive earlier the next day. I saved my work, turned off the computer, and gathered my things. I was anxious to leave that floor, to go home and forget that strange experience. But when I was walking toward the elevators, I heard something that made me stop. They were footsteps. Slow footsteps coming from the corridor I had just left. I turned slowly toward the corridor. The night lighting created a play of light and shadow that made it difficult to see clearly, but I was sure I was hearing footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate footsteps, as if someone were walking slowly down the marble corridor. The sound echoed off the walls, creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to approach. "Is someone there?" I asked, but my voice came out weaker than I intended. The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if whoever was walking had heard my question and decided to stop to listen. I stood for a few seconds, waiting. My heart was beating so hard I could hear the sound in my ear. My breathing was accelerated, and I felt a drop of sweat run down my forehead despite the air conditioning. Then the footsteps resumed, but this time they seemed to be approaching faster. I didn't wait to see who it was. I ran toward the elevators, pressing the button several times in succession. The sound of my own footsteps mixed with the footsteps coming from the corridor, creating a confusing and terrifying echo. The elevator took an eternity to arrive. When the doors finally opened, I entered quickly and pressed the ground floor button. While the doors were closing, I looked one last time toward the corridor. I didn't see anyone, but the footsteps continued, now closer to the area where I had been. The doors closed completely, and the elevator started descending. I leaned against the back wall, breathing heavily, trying to calm down. This couldn't be happening. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was the building security guard making rounds, or maybe it was someone from the cleaning crew who had arrived early. Commercial buildings have movement during the night, people who work different hours. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. The footsteps had something wrong, something that didn't seem human. It was the rhythm, maybe, or the way they echoed. When I reached the ground floor, I quickly exited the elevator and walked toward the exit. The security guard was at the reception, reading a newspaper. "Good evening, Michael. Leaving late today," he said, looking up. "Good evening, Frank," I replied, trying to sound normal. "Hey, did you see anyone else go up to the 32nd floor tonight?" He thought for a moment. "No, Michael, why?" "Oh, nothing. I thought I heard someone up there." Frank frowned. "That's strange. No one went up tonight, I'm sure of it." I thanked him and left the building, feeling the fresh night air on my skin. Michigan Avenue still had traffic, cars passing, some people walking. The normalcy of the street calmed me a bit. I walked to the bus stop, still thinking about what had happened. If no one had gone up to the floor who was making those footsteps and who had called my name. During the trip home, I tried to find rational explanations. Maybe it was some problem with the building's sound system, or maybe it was some echo coming from other floors. Old buildings have strange acoustics. But when I got home and lay down, I couldn't stop thinking about that voice calling my name. There was something familiar about it, something that bothered me deeply. And the worst part, I knew I would have to go back the next day. The next morning, I tried to act as if nothing had happened. I arrived at the office at the normal time, greeted colleagues, participated in meetings. During the day, with the normal movement of the office, everything seemed normal. But as the hours passed and colleagues started leaving, anxiety increased. Around 7 p.m., when only a few people remained on the floor, I started feeling that familiar tension. I tried to finish my work earlier, but I had an important presentation the next day and needed to review the slides. I had no choice but to stay until later. At 9 p.m., I was the last one on the floor again. The silence returned, along with that oppressive feeling I had experienced the night before. I tried to concentrate on work, but I was constantly looking toward the corridor. For an hour, nothing happened. I started relaxing, thinking maybe the previous night's experience had been an isolated episode. Maybe it was stress or accumulated fatigue. But around 10 p.m., I heard it again. Michael. This time there was no doubt. The voice was clear, came from the corridor, and was calling my name. But there was something different in the tone. It seemed more urgent, more insistent. I got up from the chair, but this time I didn't go to investigate. I stood next to my desk, observing the corridor entrance. The night lighting created the same shadows as the night before. Michael, come here. The voice was now forming complete sentences, and there was something in the intonation that made me feel a chill. It was as if whoever was speaking had known my name for a long time. I picked up my phone and turned on the flashlight, directing the beam toward the corridor. The light revealed what I already knew. There was no one there. But the voice continued, Michael, I need to talk to you. This time I managed to identify something in the voice that disturbed me even more. It was a female voice, and there was something familiar about it, something that stirred a distant memory I couldn't identify. I started walking slowly toward the corridor, keeping the phone's flashlight on. Each step echoed in the silence, and I felt like I was being watched by invisible eyes. When I reached the corridor entrance, the cold returned, but this time it was more intense, almost unbearable. My breath formed vapor clouds, and I started shivering. Who's there? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The answer came immediately, as if whoever was speaking had been waiting for the question. You know who I am, Michael. You've always known. And that's when I recognized the voice. It was Lisa. Lisa, who had worked with me at that same company 4 years earlier. Lisa, who had been my project colleague, my partner in several important presentations. Lisa, who had died in a car accident on a rainy night, coming home after a meeting that had extended until late. My blood froze. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be her. Lisa was dead. I had gone to the funeral, seen the coffin being buried. Lisa, I whispered, barely able to form the word. Do you remember me? Said the voice, and now I had absolute certainty it was her. The same gentle tone, the same way of speaking, the same inflections I knew so well. This isn't possible. You're dead, I said, more to myself than to her. I am, confirmed the voice. But I'm still here, still in this place where I spent so many nights working late, just like you're doing now. I started trembling, not just from the cold, but from fear. This couldn't be happening. Dead people don't come back to talk. There's no life after death. There are no ghosts. But the voice continued, and each word confirmed it was really Lisa. Do you remember the last night we worked together here, Michael? It was a Thursday, like today. We were preparing the presentation for the morning client. I remembered. We had stayed until almost midnight finishing the slides, discussing every detail, making sure everything was perfect. Lisa was a perfectionist, always wanted everything to be impeccable. I said I was worried about the rain, continued the voice. Said maybe it would be better to call a taxi instead of driving. But you said I was exaggerating, that it was just a passing rain. The memory came back with full force. I really had said that. Lisa was worried about the weather, but I had minimized the situation. I said she was a good driver, that she would manage to get home without problems. That night she died on a dangerous curve in heavy rain. The car skidded and hit a tree. The police said she died instantly. "You feel guilty," said the voice, now closer. "You've always felt guilty." It was true. For months after the accident, I blamed myself. I thought that if I had been more insistent, if I had offered help, Lisa would still be alive. The guilt consumed me for a time until I managed to accept it wasn't my responsibility. Or at least, that's what I thought. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Because you need to understand something," Lisa replied. "You need to know the truth about that night." "What truth?" I asked. Although part of me didn't want to know the answer, Lisa's voice became more serious, more loaded with emotion. "I didn't die because of the rain, Michael. I died because I was exhausted. I had been working 16 hours a day for weeks, sleeping 4 hours a night, living on coffee and anxiety. I felt a weight in my stomach. I knew Lisa was overloaded, but at the time we all were. It was a difficult period at the company, with many simultaneous projects and tight deadlines. That night when I left here, I could barely keep my eyes open. It wasn't the rain that killed me, it was sleep. I dozed off at the wheel for a few seconds, and when I woke up, it was too late. The revelation hit me like a punch to the stomach. Lisa had died from fatigue, from exhaustion. And I, as her project partner, as someone who worked directly with her, should have noticed. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. "Because you're doing the same thing," said Lisa. "You're working late every night, killing yourself with work, just like I did, and I can't let this happen again." I looked around the empty office, at the piles of papers on my desk, at the computer that stayed on until late hours. Lisa was right. Since the promotion, I had been working obsessively, arriving early and leaving late, taking work home on weekends. "I see you here every night," continued the voice. "I see you killing yourself with work, consuming yourself, losing your life because of reports and presentations that no one will remember in a year." "But I need to work," I protested. "I have responsibilities, goals to meet." "I thought the same thing," said Lisa, and there was sadness in her voice. "I thought if I worked more, if I dedicated myself more, I would be recognized, promoted, successful. But in the end, none of that mattered. In the end, I died alone on a dark road, and the company simply hired someone else to replace me." Lisa's words echoed in the office silence. She was right. After her death, the company had mourned for a few days, but soon life returned to normal. Her projects were redistributed, her desk was occupied by another person, and in a few months, it was as if she had never existed. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "I want you to go home," said Lisa. "I want you to stop killing yourself with work. I want you to live the life I couldn't live." I felt tears in my eyes. The guilt I thought I had overcome returned with full force. Lisa had died, and I was repeating the same mistakes that led to her death. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm sorry for not noticing, for not helping." "I know," said Lisa, and her voice was now gentler. "But you can help me now. You can do things differently." The cold began to diminish, and I felt Lisa's presence moving away. "Go home, Michael," she said one last time, "and don't come back to work late. Promise me." "I promise," I said, and I really meant it. The silence returned to the office, But this time it wasn't oppressive. It was a silence of peace, of resolution. I immediately turned off the computer, gathered my things, and left the office. During the elevator ride down, I thought about everything Lisa had told me. She was right about everything. In the days that followed, I completely changed my work routine. I started leaving at normal hours, delegating more tasks, establishing clear boundaries between work and personal life. At first, it was difficult. I felt like I was being irresponsible, like I was neglecting my obligations. But gradually, I realized that my productivity didn't decrease. In fact, working fewer hours, but with more focus and energy, I managed to do more in less time. My health improved, my mood improved, my relationships improved. A few weeks later, I talked to my boss about the work culture at the company. I suggested changes in how we distributed workloads, how we set deadlines, how we cared for employee well-being. To my surprise, he was receptive to the ideas. We implemented some new policies, flexible hours, limits on overtime, wellness programs. It wasn't a radical change, but it was a start. I never heard Lisa's voice in the office again, but sometimes when I was working late and remembered the promise I had made, I felt like she was there, reminding me to go home. Months later, I was organizing some old files when I found a photo of the team from 4 years ago. Lisa was there, smiling next to all of us. She looked so alive, so full of energy and ambition. I thought about how she had died alone on that road, exhausted, victim of a work culture that values dedication more than life. And I thought about how many other people were going through the same situation at that moment, in other offices, in other companies. I decided to do something more concrete. I started giving talks about work-life balance, about the dangers of overwork culture. I told Lisa's story, obviously without mentioning the supernatural aspects, focusing on the importance of taking care of mental and physical health. The response was surprising. Many people identified with the story. Many recognized signs of exhaustion in themselves. Some changed their routines, others sought professional help. I don't know if Lisa is still around, observing, approving the changes I made. But I like to think she is. I like to think her death wasn't in vain, that her message is helping other people avoid the same fate. Today, when I pass by the 32nd floor of the building in downtown Chicago, especially at night, I feel a familiar presence. It's not frightening like it was before. It's comforting, like an old friend reminding me to take care of myself. And whenever I see a colleague working too late, whenever I notice signs of exhaustion in someone, I remember the promise I made to Lisa. I remember that work is important, but life is more important. Because in the end, no one should die because of a report. No one should sacrifice their life for a presentation. And if Lisa's story can prevent this from happening to someone else, then maybe her presence in that dark corridor was worth it. Sometimes the dead come back not to haunt us, but to save us. And sometimes the most important message we can receive is the simplest one. Go home. Take care of yourself. And if a story like Lisa's can save even one life, then maybe all this supernatural experience had a purpose. Maybe some messages are so important that they transcend death itself to reach us. My name is Oliver, and I'm 65 years old now. This story happened when I was 12, during what was supposed to be a peaceful summer visit to my grandfather's ranch in eastern Montana, back in 1971. I remember arriving at Copper Creek Ranch just as the sun was painting the sky orange around 6 in the morning. The Greyhound bus had dropped me off at the crossroads, and my grandfather Jack was waiting there in his old Ford pickup, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw me. The ranch was everything I'd imagined from his letters: rolling hills dotted with cattle, a sprawling wooden house with a wraparound porch, and the kind of silence you only find miles from any town. My grandmother Emma welcomed me with fresh-baked bread and milk, still warm from the morning milking. 2 of my cousins, Danny and Mike, had arrived the day before, and we were all bunked together in the upstairs room under the eaves. The first few days passed like any ranch visit should, helping with chores, exploring the creek, and listening to the ranch hands tell tall tales around the evening fire. But I noticed something odd about the third night. As darkness fell, my grandfather positioned himself on the porch with his hunting rifle across his knees, and I could see several of the ranch hands doing the same near the cattle pens. When we asked if we could play outside after dinner, Grandpa Jack's face grew serious. "Boys," he said, taking a long draw from his pipe, "nighttime out here belongs to things that are better left alone. You'll stay inside once the sun goes down." I pressed him for an explanation, but he just shook his head and said, "Some troubles are best handled by grown men with experience and good aim." Grandma Emma called us inside and served us slices of apple pie with cold milk. The ranch house didn't have electricity in those days. We relied on kerosene lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. After we finished eating, she insisted we go to bed early, but not before leading us in prayer. I remember her voice, steady and strong, as she asked for protection through the night. We 3 boys lay in our narrow beds, whispering in the darkness about what kind of danger might be lurking outside. Our imaginations ran wild with stories of bears, mountain lions, and worse things that might prowl the Montana wilderness. Around midnight, we heard the sound of splintering wood from somewhere near the barn. Creeping to the window, we peered through the curtains and saw 3 ranch hands building a massive bonfire near the cattle pen. The flames leaped high into the night sky, and we watched as the men climbed into the branches of a nearby oak tree, rifles in hand, their eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. "Probably watching for wolves," Danny whispered, and we all agreed that made sense. We'd heard stories of wolf packs taking down cattle, so we figured that's all it was and went back to bed. But in the early hours before dawn, the crack of gunfire shattered the silence. We bolted upright as shots rang out in rapid succession, followed by shouting voices and the sound of running boots on wooden planks. We were about to rush to the window when Grandma Emma appeared in our doorway, her face pale in the lamplight. "Stay quiet and stay in your beds," she said firmly. "What's happening, Grandma?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Nothing you boys need to worry about. Just stay silent and it'll all be over soon." But contrary to her reassurance, the gunfire continued for what felt like hours, only stopping when the rooster began crowing at first light. The next morning, we found Grandpa Jack talking in hushed tones with the ranch foreman, a grizzled man named Hank. As we approached, I caught the tail end of their conversation. "Boss, this time the creature wasn't spooked by the gunfire. It took down 2 steers before we could drive it off. We put several rounds into it, but the thing moves like lightning. Soon as it saw us coming, it vanished into the tree line. They noticed us listening and quickly changed the subject, but we weren't about to let it drop. "What creature, Grandpa?" Mike asked. Grandpa Jack sighed, removed his hat, and ran his fingers through his gray hair. "Boys, sit yourselves down on this here fence rail. I reckon it's time you knew what we're dealing with." He began his story in a voice heavy with worry. "For the past month, something's been attacking our livestock. It's not like any predator I've seen in 40 years of ranching. This thing walks upright like a man, but has the strength and claws of a wild animal. It's already killed more than a dozen head of cattle, and twice it's tried to break into the bunkhouse where the hands sleep." I felt a chill run down my spine as he continued. "It's massive, bigger than any wolf or bear in these parts. The tracks we've found show claws longer than my fingers, and the way it tears into the cattle. It's not natural." "Was that the creature we heard last night?" I asked. "That's right, boy. And here's the strangest part. It only comes on Thursday nights, regular as clockwork. I've armed every man on this ranch and set up watches, but the thing's too smart and too fast." Hank spat into the dust and added, "Even the bonfires aren't scaring it off anymore. Last night, with all that firelight, it still managed to kill 2 prize steers and disappear before we could get a clean shot." Grandpa Jack stood up and placed his hand on my shoulder. "Now don't you boys go getting scared. As long as you stay inside after dark, you'll be safe. This is between me and whatever's out there." After hearing this terrifying account, he sent us off to play with the ranch hand's children. The ranch had a main house where my grandparents lived, and about 100 yards away stood the bunkhouse and smaller cabins for the workers and their families. We found the other kids down by the creek, but on our way there, we passed the cattle pen and saw something that made my stomach turn. 2 ranch hands were loading the carcasses of massive steers onto a flatbed truck. The animals were covered in deep claw marks and bite wounds that looked nothing like any predator attack I'd ever seen or heard about. We spent the day swimming and fishing, trying to forget what we'd witnessed. But as evening approached, the other children began heading home with obvious urgency. "Aren't you scared of this creature?" I asked one of the boys. "Of course we are," he replied. "My pa says it'll eat anything it finds wandering around at night. We're not taking any chances." "Come on," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "It's probably just a bear or something, and my grandfather said it only shows up on Thursday nights." "Maybe so," the boy answered, "but better safe than sorry. Bear or monster, we're not sticking around to find out." That evening, we sat on the porch with Grandpa Jack and the ranch hands, listening to their stories and watching the sun disappear behind the hills. Around 8 o'clock, Hank stood up and checked his rifle. "Boss, I better get to my watch position," he said. "No need tonight," Grandpa Jack replied. "It's only Tuesday. The creature won't show until Thursday." I couldn't contain my curiosity any longer. "Grandpa, how can you be so sure it's not just a bear or a wolf?" My grandfather's eyes grew distant as he answered, "Son, I've seen this thing with my own eyes, and so has your grandmother. No bear walks on 2 legs the way this creature does. No wolf kills cattle just for sport, leaving most of the meat untouched. This thing has intelligence. It knows our men are armed now, and it's learned to use the darkness to its advantage." He turned to Hank and said, "Tell them what you saw, Hank." The foreman shifted uncomfortably in his chair before speaking. "I've been ranching for 30 years, and I know the difference between animal attacks and something else entirely. This creature hunts like a predator, but thinks like a human. It only kills the young calves for food. The full-grown steers it just slaughters for the pleasure of it. That's why we started the bonfires," another ranch hand added. "We figured if we could see it coming, we'd have a better chance of driving it off. But the thing's getting bolder each week." The men continued sharing their encounters until Grandma Emma called us inside for the night. After our prayers, as she was about to leave our room, I asked her the question that had been nagging at me all day. "Grandma, why does this thing only attack on Thursday nights?" She paused at the doorway, her face troubled. "Because, child, what we're dealing with isn't natural. The old stories say that cursed souls can only take their beast form on certain nights, and Thursday to Friday has always been a powerful time for dark magic. The days crawled by until Thursday arrived. As darkness fell, everyone retreated to their homes except for the armed men who took their positions around the cattle pens. We boys were already in our room when Grandma Emma came to pray with us, and after she left, we couldn't resist creeping to the window. We pressed our faces against the glass, determined to catch a glimpse of whatever had been terrorizing the ranch. Near midnight, the shooting started. We watched in terrified fascination as muzzle flashes lit up the darkness, and we could hear the ranch hands shouting to each other. Then we saw it. The creature moved through the shadows like liquid darkness, but when it passed in front of the bonfire, we got a clear look at the thing that had been haunting our nights. It was enormous, easily 7 feet tall when standing upright. Its body was covered in dark fur, and its eyes reflected the firelight like burning coals. The way it moved was the most unsettling part, sometimes on all fours like a wolf, sometimes upright like a man, but always with an unnatural grace that sent chills down my spine. We watched as the ranch dogs tracked its movements, barking furiously as they tried to corner it. The men followed with their rifles, but the creature was too fast and too smart, always staying one step ahead of their attacks. The gunfire continued until dawn, and throughout the night, Grandma Emma kept checking on us. Each time she entered our room, we pretended to be asleep, but I could see the worry etched on her face. The next morning, we confessed to our grandparents that we'd been watching from the window. They were furious, explaining that the creature might have seen us and could have tried to break into the house. We were just 3 children, they said, easy targets if the thing decided to hunt us instead of cattle. "You boys were lucky," Grandpa Jack said sternly. "Don't you ever pull a stunt like that again." The following week brought an unexpected delivery to the ranch. A large truck arrived carrying what looked like an enormous cage, the kind used to trap dangerous animals alive. It was divided into 2 sections, with a mechanism that would allow something to enter one side while keeping it separated from bait placed in the other. When I asked my grandfather about it, his eyes lit up with determination. "This is how we're going to end this nightmare once and for all. I'm going to catch this creature alive, and when the sun rises and it changes back into its human form, I'll know exactly who's been terrorizing my ranch." "How does it work?" Danny asked. "Simple enough," Grandpa Jack explained. "One of our cows gave birth to a calf last week. Since the creature seems to prefer young animals, I'll put the calf in the protected section as bait. When the beast enters the cage to get to the calf, the door will slam shut automatically. Then all we have to do is wait for sunrise. The next day, my grandfather sent word to town for the pastor to come bless the trap. Pastor Williams arrived that afternoon, sprinkled holy water on the cage, and said prayers over it. Before leaving, he made my grandfather promise not to kill whatever they caught. "I won't kill it," Grandpa Jack assured him. "But I can't promise the same about what I'll do to the person responsible once they change back." The pastor smiled grimly and headed back to town. Over the next few days, the ranch hands worked to disguise the trap. They built a small pen around it, making it look like just another cattle enclosure. When they finished, you couldn't tell there was a cage hidden inside. Thursday night arrived with an overcast sky that seemed to promise trouble. The men placed the calf in the protected section of the trap and left the entrance open. They lit their usual bonfire and took their positions, trying to make everything appear normal. This time we boys stayed away from the window, but we could hear the calf bleeding pitifully in the distance. Around 2 in the morning, we heard gunshots followed by shouts of celebration. Minutes later, someone pounded on our front door. Through our window, we could see Grandpa Jack and several ranch hands standing in the yard with their lanterns, huge grins on their faces. Grandma Emma rushed into our room and found us at the window again. "You boys and your curiosity," she said, but this time she was smiling. "No need to hide anymore. The trap worked. They caught the creature." "Can we see it?" Mike asked excitedly. "In the morning," she replied. "Right now, you need your sleep. Tomorrow you'll find out who's been causing all this trouble." None of us slept much that night, but at first light, we raced to the cattle pen where a crowd had already gathered. The calf was still bleeding on one side of the trap, but in the main section, huddled in a corner, was an old man, naked, filthy, and shivering. Grandpa Jack opened the gate, and I could see the recognition in his eyes and the faces of the other adults. They all knew who it was. Arliss Blackwood, my grandfather said with disgust, should have known. Arliss Blackwood was a hermit who lived in a shack about 10 miles from the ranch. He was known throughout the county as a practitioner of dark arts, and decent folks avoided him whenever possible. He had a reputation for cruelty to animals and was suspected of using them in his occult rituals. More than once, people had found their pets missing after Blackwood had been seen in the area. The ranch hands were ready to give him the beating of his life, but Grandpa Jack held them back. "Don't dirty your hands on this piece of filth," he said. Then he threw some old clothes at Blackwood. "Get dressed and get off my land. If I ever see you near my ranch again, or if even one more animal goes missing in this county, I'll let my men finish what they started here today." Blackwood dressed quickly, never saying a word, his eyes filled with shame and fear. He stumbled out of the cage and hurried away from the ranch as fast as his old legs could carry him. We learned later that same day that Blackwood had packed up his shack and left the county entirely. Word spread quickly about what had happened, and no one was sorry to see him go. That weekend, Grandpa Jack threw a celebration that brought together families from ranches all across the valley. There was barbecue, music, and dancing that lasted well into the night. For the first time in weeks, children could play outside after dark, and parents could sleep peacefully. The attacks stopped completely after that night. In all the years since, I've never heard another report of the creature that terrorized Copper Creek Ranch during that summer of 1971. Looking back now, more than 50 years later, I sometimes wonder if I dreamed the whole thing. But then, I remember the fear in my grandmother's eyes, the determination in my grandfather's voice, and the sight of that thing moving through the shadows, like something that shouldn't exist in our world. Some mysteries are better left buried, but some truths need to be told. This is one story I'll never forget, no matter how many years pass. My name is Marcus, and what I'm about to tell you happened 25 years ago in the Louisiana Bayou country. But the memory still haunts me like it was yesterday. It's a story that confirmed for me that some legends are terrifyingly real, and that the old warnings passed down through generations aren't just superstitions meant to keep young folks in line. Back in 1999, I was 23 years old, living in a small town called Cypress Bend with 4 of my closest friends: Anton, Clay, Samuel, and Jake. We all worked together at Jake's father's metalworking shop, and despite our different backgrounds, we'd formed a brotherhood that I thought nothing could shake. Jake's older sister was getting married that spring to a wealthy rancher who owned a massive cattle operation deep in the Texas Panhandle. The wedding was planned for May 14th, a date that made all the old-timers in our town shake their heads and mutter about the month of hauntings. We laughed it off back then. Even Jake couldn't understand why his sister chose that particular month. But a party was a party, and according to what we'd heard, this wasn't going to be some small affair. I had a 1976 Dodge Coronet that my father had given me, a 4-door beast that could fit all 5 of us comfortably. The plan was simple. Jake's father would drive ahead with his wife and younger daughters, and we'd follow in my car. The journey to the ranch went smoothly. We left Cypress Bend before dawn and arrived at the sprawling Texas property by 9 in the morning on May 14th. The ranch was everything we'd expected, and more, thousands of acres of open grassland stretching to the horizon, with the main house looking like something out of a magazine. We helped with the final preparations, and by 5 in the evening, we were watching Jake's sister say her vows against the backdrop of a stunning Texas sunset. The mosquitoes were fierce, but nobody seemed to care. The celebration that followed was unlike anything we'd ever experienced. We drank, danced, and feasted like kings that Friday night. Saturday brought more of the same. They'd slaughtered a steer and 2 hogs for the occasion, and the festivities continued well into the night. We 5 young men, none of us older than 25, were living it up like there was no tomorrow. But Sunday morning brought complications. Jake's father announced he was heading back to Louisiana that day, but the groom's brother, who'd become our drinking buddy over the weekend, begged us to stay for the rodeo and the band coming in from Austin. Against Jake's father's wishes, we promised we'd leave early Monday morning and be back at work by dawn. The older man wasn't happy. He warned us that we'd had enough celebrating and should head home with him. But we were young and foolish, and we assured him we'd make it back just fine. Sunday was incredible, but I made sure to stop drinking by evening since I knew I'd be driving that night. My friends weren't as considerate with their livers, and by 10 o'clock, Samuel, Clay, Anton, and Jake were thoroughly drunk and resistant to leaving. It took some convincing, but I finally managed to get them in the car. We said our goodbyes, and I started the long drive back to Louisiana, feeling a strange tension in the air that made my fingertips tingle with unease. The highway toward the state line was completely dark, except for my headlights cutting through the blackness. In the distance, lightning flickered across the cloudy sky, and the wind carried the promise of an approaching storm. At first, my passengers were animated, shouting and continuing to drink in the car, but soon they fell into a contemplative silence. All except Samuel, who passed out almost immediately. I could see they were exhausted, and rightfully so, but they didn't fall asleep. Instead, they asked me to turn on the radio. I tried to tune into any station, but every frequency was filled with static. The only option to break the oppressive silence was conversation. But before any of us could say a word, a long, melodic whistle echoed so close to the car that I thought one of my friends was playing a prank. "That's not funny, don't mess around with that stuff," Anton said suddenly from the passenger seat. He turned around, and I glanced at the others in the rearview mirror, but neither Clay nor Jake were laughing. In fact, I watched them turn pale, and Samuel was still unconscious. I was looking at all three of them in the back when I heard that whistle again, but this time it seemed farther away. In that moment, all the legends and stories from my childhood came flooding back. The alcohol drained from my friends' systems instantly, and Samuel woke up from the commotion, asking what was wrong. We didn't need to explain, because just as he asked the question, the whistle sounded again distant, miles away from us. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, my heart pounding in my throat, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, because I remembered the legend of the whistler. The farther away you hear the whistle, the closer it actually is. The legend tells of a young man who, in a fit of rage, murdered his own father and ate his liver. When his grandfather discovered the horrific act, he tied the boy to a post, flayed his back with a whip, rubbed hot peppers into the wounds, and set the dogs on him while cursing him to wander the earth carrying his father's bones until God forgave him. His spirit now roams the southern lands, taking out his anger and pain on drunkards and adulterers he encounters on lonely roads, warning of his approach with his long, melodic whistle that sounds farther away the closer he gets. But it was just a legend, wasn't it? Just a story told to keep young people from drinking too much and wandering alone at night. A final, distant whistle sounded just before absolute silence fell over us. Only the wind outside the car and the rumble of distant thunder that coincided with a powerful blow to the passenger door. Anton pressed against me while I checked the rear view and side mirrors, trying to see if someone was surrounding us. My friends screamed in terror, and Samuel suddenly cried out in pain as he felt something strike his ribs. Jake let out a yell that nearly deafened us when he felt a blow to the center of his back. Things had spiraled completely out of control, and as I tried to flee from an entity I'd believed my whole life was fictional, I finally saw it. At the roadside sat a figure of disturbing proportions, tall and gaunt, wearing tattered clothes and a wide-brimmed hat, with a sack slung over his shoulder. Though he was sitting, he was taller than my car. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I caught the malicious glint in his eyes as we passed, and I knew without a doubt that this was the whistler. We flew past him, but that instant was enough for him to land several more blows on the boys, everyone except me, the only one who hadn't been drinking. A final whistle, close this time, put an end to that nightmare as I kept driving, and a torrential rain began to fall around us. When we reached the state line, the Border Patrol officers asked what had happened to us. We didn't know what to tell them, but it was obvious something had occurred. The terror was written all over our faces. It was then that an older officer, maybe 50 or 60 years old, told us to move along after checking our passports. He advised us to be careful in the month of May, and suggested we not drink so much if we didn't want it to happen again. He didn't need us to explain anything. He could tell just by looking at our faces and the bruises that were already starting to show. As we drove toward Cypress Bend, we all remained silent, sober, and wide awake, wondering if everything that had happened was real. I couldn't quite believe it, but the others had the solid proof on their skin that something had occurred to us in those Texas backroads. I dropped each friend off at his house, and when I arrived at mine, I asked for my mother's blessing. She was waiting up for me. I apologized for worrying her and went to bed, but I couldn't sleep because all I could see when I closed my eyes was that horrifying figure by the roadside. The next morning, after getting no sleep at all, I went to work where Jake's father asked me, very concerned, what had happened to us. Jake had a fever and was shaking, and neither Samuel nor Clay had shown up yet. Anton was there, but was restless and had large bruises on his arms and body. I didn't want to tell Jake's father what we'd experienced until the others arrived to confirm I hadn't lost my mind. He suspected what had happened and could intuit the truth, but didn't want to accept it. It took 2 full days for all of us to return to work, and when we were finally reunited, Jake's father scolded us for the risk we'd taken. In his way, without saying it directly, he made it clear that we'd gotten what we deserved. From that day forward, we controlled our drinking and never drank that heavily again, but the consequences remained in the form of scars. Samuel was left with lasting effects, small tremors in his hands and neck that still persist today. I can no longer drive at night, and on the rare occasions when a trip runs late, my wife has to give me a sedative and take the wheel herself. The 5 of us still get together at least once a month. We're good friends, and each has made his own life. But we don't usually talk about that night since it's uncomfortable and painful for everyone, especially for those who experienced the Whistler's wrath firsthand. As for me, I haven't doubted his existence for a single second since that May night. What I still wonder about when I hear the old stories is what other things are real and what are just myths. Does he only attack drunkards or anyone unlucky enough to cross his path? And if he's real, as I was able to prove, what about the other legends of the South? I don't know, but I'm certain of one thing. I don't need to find out to have a deep respect for them all. Because, as the old saying goes, just because you can't see them doesn't mean they're not there. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.